We got an exclusive look at a drug sub, which are manufactured by the cartel. Inside, it's low-tech. A basic steering wheel, throttles, gauges, a compass. There are pumps to drain water. This is the storage area where the drugs are stashed and kept dry.
They were never meant to exist. Built deep in the Colombian jungle and launched into the open ocean, the Narco Submarines were the drug cartel's answer to law enforcement patrols.
Drug smugglers are even using submarines to bring millions of dollars worth of cocaine.
At first, they seemed too bizarre to be real, but when naval divers began recovering their sunken remains, what they found inside was far more disturbing than anyone expected.
It's so hot. I've been in here for 30 seconds and I'm already dripping with sweat. These are two bunk beds that are about not even 6 foot long.
The birth of Narco Submarines. It all began in the late 1980s, deep in the heart of Colombia's dense jungles. Drug cartels, under increasing pressure from U.S. authorities, found themselves desperate for new ways to move cocaine. The U.S. Coast Guard had tightened its grip on the Caribbean and Pacific routes. Radar systems were sharper, patrols were more frequent, and fast boats. The smugglers' favorite method were getting intercepted more often. Time was running out. The walls were closing in. But the cartels had no plans to give up. When speedboats failed, they looked somewhere no one expected. Underwater. In hidden workshops tucked beneath thick jungle canopies, cartel engineers started building something the world had never seen. They were not proper submarines, but something close. Made from cheap fiberglass and wood, these vessels were half-submerged and rode just low enough in the water to escape radar detection. Crude and improvised, yes, but they worked. At first the idea sounded like a joke. When U.S. officials heard rumors of homemade submarines, they dismissed them with laughter. Who would build submarines in the jungle? But that laughter didn't last long. In time, they caught one, then another, then a dozen more. The shock was immediate. These weren't isolated cases. It was an operation. Something massive and terrifying was unfolding beneath the waves. The cartels were no longer just criminals with guns and bribes. They were innovators. They were building their own navy. The earliest models were rough and dangerous. They had no navigation systems. Their engines were loud. Their hulls leaked in high waves. Inside, it was pitch dark and unbearably hot. Crew members often passed out from fumes. Some never made it out alive, but the cargo did. These boats carried thousands of kilos of cocaine undetected across international waters. That was all that mattered to the cartels. The cartels had found a new weapon, and it wasn't a gun. It was an idea, a machine born of desperation, secrecy, and ruthless determination. What began in the shadows of the jungle had become one of the deadliest and most ingenious tools of modern drug trafficking, and it was just the beginning. Engineering marvels in the jungle. By the 2000s, the crude, leaky boats were gone. In their place were high-tech stealth machines built for long-range missions and designed to vanish beneath the surface without a trace. These vessels could now travel over 2,500 miles without stopping, far enough to cross the Pacific Ocean from Colombia to Mexico, or even reach the coastlines of the United States. But this wasn't just about distance. These subs were now engineered with military precision. They were no longer floating on hope. They were gliding on cold, calculated science. The cartels had recruited a new breed of talent, former naval officers, Soviet-trained engineers, and corrupt commercial shipbuilders who knew how to build ships that could survive in the open ocean. These weren't desperate jungle tinkerers. They were professionals, men with years of experience in designing vessels meant to disappear. The submarines they built were terrifying in their sophistication. Each one came equipped with diesel-electric engines that allowed for quieter movement and longer range. GPS systems were installed so the boats could follow exact smuggling routes with pinpoint accuracy. Ballast tanks gave them control over depth. Their hulls were covered in radar-absorbing material, making them nearly invisible to surveillance aircraft and Coast Guard patrols. Some even had periscopes and snorkels made from salvaged naval equipment. These weren't just transport vessels. They were smuggling fortresses. Most could carry up to 7 tons of cocaine at a time, worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The interiors were airtight. The engine exhaust was redirected beneath the surface to reduce heat signatures. Every inch of space was carefully planned, every system built for one purpose: avoid detection and complete the mission at any cost. What made it worse was where and how they were built. Construction sites were hidden far inside the jungle, unreachable by road and invisible to drones. These weren't just workshops. They were secret military-grade shipyards. Armed guards stood watch 24/7. The workers, Skilled welders and mechanics lived on site for weeks, cut off from the outside world. They worked in silence and in darkness, welding steel hulls by hand, assembling propulsion systems, and pressure testing their creations using homemade tools. Some of the submarines even had a final chilling feature, a kill switch. If a patrol boat or aircraft got too close, the crew could trigger an internal mechanism that flooded the sub in minutes. The vessels would sink fast, dragging everything inside, drugs, weapons, documents, and sometimes people, down to the ocean floor. It was a death sentence written into the design. For the cartels, this was simply part of doing business. Losing a load was better than getting caught. One sunken sub meant a few million lost, but it also meant no arrests, no confessions, and no evidence. They considered it a fair trade. Law enforcement agencies began referring to them as Bigfoots of the sea. Everyone knew they existed, but catching one was like chasing a ghost. When authorities did manage to intercept one before it was scuttled, what they found inside was shocking. The engineering was cold, clean, and precise. And yet, despite all the technology, these narco subs weren't just machines. They were floating coffins. Life inside a narco sub. Inside the narco subs, the reality was far worse than most people could imagine. Each vessel carried a small crew, usually between 3 to 6 men, all squeezed into a tight metal tube with barely enough room to sit upright. They were sealed inside for days, sometimes even weeks, with no windows, no light from the outside world, and no fresh air. The heat was suffocating. Temperatures often soared past 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, oil, and diesel fumes. Breathing was a struggle. Movement was limited. There was no privacy. There were no real sleeping areas, just cramped corners or the cold metal floor. There were no bathrooms. Men were forced to relieve themselves in bottles or bags, which were kept on board for the duration of the journey. The stench was unbearable. Showers were impossible. Clean clothes were a luxury no one had. Food was tightly rationed. Canned goods, crackers, and a few plastic jugs of water were shared among the crew. Every drop counted. Water was more valuable than gold inside that steel coffin. A mistake in planning or a leak in the supply could quickly lead to dehydration. There was constant noise. The low, endless thrum of the engine, the creaks of the hull under pressure, and the sound of the ocean pressing in from all sides. But there was also another kind of noise, fear. It was in every breath, every whispered conversation, every silent prayer. Every mile traveled brought more tension. A single wrong turn, a mechanical failure, or surfacing in the wrong waters could bring disaster. And everyone on board knew one terrible truth. If something went wrong, there was no rescue. No one was coming. Their only orders were to destroy the evidence. If they were caught, they were expected to scuttle the sub, sink the cargo, and go down with it. Veteran smugglers later told stories that left even seasoned investigators disturbed. Some spoke of hallucinations, of men going mad in the darkness, screaming about drowning even when the vessel was dry. Others told of crew members who lost track of time and began clawing at the metal walls, convinced they were buried alive. The extreme heat, lack of oxygen, and sheer mental pressure pushed some to the edge. There were tales of engines failing in the middle of open water. The lights would flicker, the temperature would rise, and the fear of implosion would grip the crew like a vice. Some men began praying non-stop. Others simply broke. But the worst stories were the ones that couldn't be confirmed, only whispered. Rumors spread that not everyone inside the submarines had agreed to be there. Some men were said to have been kidnapped, forced onto the vessels at gunpoint. Others were believed to have been blackmailed, threatened with harm to their families if they refused. There were even reports that certain crew members had been chained to interior pipes, locked in place to prevent them from escaping or sabotaging the mission. Some compartments were hidden entirely, used to stash extra cargo or extra bodies. Those inside had no say. They were cargo themselves. And when naval divers began recovering sunken narco subs from the ocean floor, the true horror of what had been happening beneath the surface finally came into focus. Until then, much of what was known about these vessels had come from guesses, rumors, and the rare few caught before they could be scuttled. But now, authorities were opening up the wreckage and looking inside. What they found was far worse than anyone had expected. The deadly silence beneath the waves. Inside many of these drowned narco subs were human remains. In some cases, it was just one body. In others, entire crews were discovered dead. These were men who had run out of oxygen deep below the surface, suffocating slowly in complete darkness. Some had drowned, trapped behind sealed or rusted hatches as the sub took on water. In one chilling recovery, a diver reported finding a skeleton still strapped into the pilot's seat. The bones of the man's hands were fused to the control levers, held in place by rust and the slow decay of time. Many of the bodies reportedly told stories of panic and suffering. Forensic teams noted signs of a struggle. Some corpses had broken fingers, likely from clawing at doors or trying to force open hatches in their final moments. Others had fractured jaws and skulls, suggesting fights or violent breakdowns among the crew before the vessel sank. Worst of all, some victims were found in positions that raised serious questions. They weren't at the controls. They weren't even free to move. They were locked inside storage compartments. Some were said to still be chained to the interior of the vessel, secured like cargo. These areas were not meant to hold people. They had no airflow, no lights, and no escape. Forensic experts began to speculate that some of the dead had never been part of the crew at all. They may have been prisoners, kidnapped men forced aboard or held as insurance. Their deaths were not just accidents. They may have been executed by drowning, carried out in silence, hidden at sea. One of the divers, a man with over a decade of experience in naval recovery operations, allegedly said he had never experienced anything like what he found inside those sunken subs. He described entering the remains of a fiberglass submarine hundreds of feet below the surface. There was no sound, no current, just stillness. The silence, he said, was suffocating, worse than the dark, worse than the cold. It was as if the vessel had swallowed every last trace of life and kept the memory of death sealed within. Each dive became more disturbing. The images stayed with the recovery teams long after they resurfaced. The quiet, the cold, and the twisted remains inside told stories no one could forget. And corpses weren't the only thing authorities found. Cargo beyond cocaine. While cocaine remained the primary cargo inside most narco subs, investigators soon realized that these vessels may have been used for far darker purposes. The further the authorities dug into the wreckages, the more disturbing the discoveries became. In several recoveries, divers were reported to have found large hidden compartments that did not contain drugs at all. Instead, they were packed with weapons. Crates filled with AK-47 rifles, rocket-propelled grenades, and even portable anti-aircraft systems were found strapped down inside the hull. Some of the weapons were still wrapped in oilcloth to prevent rust. Intelligence sources later confirmed these arms were likely destined for rebel militias, paramilitary groups, or rogue factions operating in unstable regions. These submarines were not just carrying narcotics. They were delivering firepower. They were floating war chests. Other vessels carried something different but just as dangerous. Millions of dollars in U.S. cash, all shrink-wrapped and sealed in watertight containers. Stacked in rows, the bills were meant to pay off partners, buy loyalty, or bankroll future operations. The scale of the money shocked investigators. These were not small-time deals. These were high-level operations, executed with military-like precision and international reach. But the most terrifying discoveries were linked to signs of human trafficking. In a few of the recovered subs, teams found narrow crawl spaces hidden beneath cargo decks. Inside, they reportedly discovered restraints bolted into the floor, ripped clothing, and personal items scattered in the darkness. The compartments were barely large enough for a person to fit inside, let alone survive a long voyage. There was no ventilation, no light, no way out once sealed. It was impossible not to imagine what might have happened inside those spaces. Intelligence reports began to paint a chilling picture. It was believed that some of these submarines had been used to transport kidnapped individuals across borders. Rival gang members, undocumented migrants, even people who owed the cartels money. These were human beings locked in steel boxes, transported in secret beneath the ocean. Many of them may never have reached land alive. They likely died slowly, alone, in silence. One particular case stunned the investigative team. Inside a recovered sub, painted on the inner hull, were strange, cryptic symbols. Some were crude drawings. Others appeared to be words or numbers arranged in unusual patterns. Experts from multiple countries were brought in to examine them. Some believed the markings were linked to narco cults. Others saw references to Santeria-inspired rituals, possibly meant as prayers or protections. But there was also another theory. These were curses, meant to ward off enemies or mark the sub for sacrifice. No one could say for sure. Each recovery revealed more secrets, and each one proved just how deep the cartel's hidden empire really went. The billion-dollar payloads. When intact narco subs were finally captured and brought to the surface, what investigators found inside left them stunned. The scale of the operation was far beyond what many had imagined. Some of these submarines were packed with up to 7 tons of cocaine. The estimated value of the cargo in just one vessel reached over $200 million. The drugs were packed tightly in waterproof, shrink-wrapped bricks. Many of them were still perfectly preserved, even after spending weeks or months under the ocean. These submarines had been hiding entire fortunes beneath the waves. The cost of building each narco sub was enormous. Estimates put the price anywhere from $1 to $3 million per vessel. The cartels spared no expense. Blueprints were closely guarded. Engineers were either paid large sums to keep quiet or threatened into cooperation. Materials came from all over the world: steel, navigation systems, fuel components, and radar-dampening paint. Shipments were smuggled in, piece by piece, sometimes disguised as parts for legal boats or farming equipment. Entire teams worked on these projects in silence. Everyone involved knew what was at stake. But no matter how expensive the build or how many lives were at risk, there was one rule that never changed. The crew was expendable. The cargo was not. The drugs were everything. The product had to move. If that meant sending a half-trained crew into a deadly situation, then so be it. In one high-profile case, a narco sub was found deliberately sunk just off the coast of Panama. It was located by chance during a routine sonar scan. When divers entered the wreck, they expected to find the usual shipment of cocaine. They did, but that wasn't all. Hidden behind a sealed panel were several journals. The pages were damaged by water but still readable. Inside were strange, cryptic notes, diagrams, coordinates, and a list of names. What shook investigators the most was that some of those names matched existing missing persons reports. Several were individuals known to have vanished near cartel-controlled zones. Some were believed to have been kidnapped. Others were simply listed as disappeared. No one had ever connected them to narco sub-operations until now. The discovery raised terrifying questions. Why were these names there? Who wrote them? Were these people crew members, victims, or something else entirely? But the most chilling part came later, because what investigators found during the most recent submarine recoveries was darker than anyone expected, and far worse than cocaine. Recent recoveries. The disturbing finds of the 2020s. In the past 5 years, a new wave of narco submarine wrecks has begun to surface, and with them have come even darker discoveries. Each recovery has pulled something more disturbing from the deep. What once seemed like high-stakes drug trafficking now appears to be something far more sinister. Authorities around the world have begun to realize that these subs may not only have been used for smuggling drugs, they may have been part of a much more terrifying system of control, violence, and secrecy. In a 2020 operation off the Pacific coast of Colombia, naval divers recovered a sunken narco sub that had been resting on the ocean floor for an unknown period. It took days to bring the vessel to the surface. When the hatch was finally opened, what was found inside shocked even the most experienced investigators. There were decomposed human remains, bodies allegedly chained directly to the bulkheads. The corpses were in such poor condition that immediate identification was impossible. Forensic teams were called in. But what made the discovery even more disturbing was what the sub had been carrying. There were no drugs on board. Instead, the cargo consisted of military-grade weapons, rifles, grenade launchers, and shoulder-fired missiles, all sealed in protective crates. Alongside them was encrypted communication gear, possibly designed for covert battlefield coordination. Whoever was inside that submarine had been part of something far more organized, and possibly far more violent than drug running alone. In another recovery, divers discovered a different kind of horror. The submarine's inner walls were etched with strange symbols, carvings done by hand into the metal. Some of the markings resembled religious or ritualistic figures. Others were unknown, difficult to interpret. Experts brought in later would say they bore resemblance to symbols used by narco cults, which often blend superstition, religion, and violence into their beliefs. The carvings were clustered around a central point, and just beneath them were what appeared to be dried bloodstains. Forensics couldn't confirm the origin, but the stains were real. They were old, and they had been there for a long time. Some parts of the sub seemed to have been carefully constructed for more than just transporting weapons or drugs. Investigators found sealed compartments that had been lined with lead and padded with insulation. At first, authorities assumed these compartments had been used to conceal high-value cargo, possibly cash or electronics, but there was no trace of such items left behind. Then came the more disturbing theory. Based on the layout, the lack of air vents, and the absence of food or water, experts began to believe those compartments may not have held contraband. They may have held people. There were no escape routes, no emergency systems, no lighting, nothing to support life, just cold silence. The idea that people had been locked in these compartments, alive and conscious, is something that still haunts those who worked on the case. If true, those individuals were entombed inside the vessel, hidden from the world, and likely forgotten by everyone except those who put them there. One particular wreck told an especially terrifying story. When the sub was opened, signs of a desperate final struggle were reportedly everywhere. There were deep claw marks scratched into the inside of the hatch, as if someone had tried to force their way out with their bare hands. A broken chain hung from the ceiling, still attached to part of a restraint system, and scratched into the paint, barely visible in the rust and grime, was a single word: Perdónanos. Forgive us. That message, carved in someone's final moments, shook even the most hardened investigators. It was not a note of resistance, it was a cry of guilt, a last confession, or maybe a prayer from someone who knew they were not coming back. As these wrecks continued to emerge from the deep, authorities began to see a new pattern. These were not just submarines used to move cocaine. These were floating prisons. They were mobile weapons depots. They were hidden chambers of torture, fear, and death. The legacy beneath the ocean. Hundreds of narco submarines are now believed to lie scattered across the ocean floor, hidden beneath the waters of the Pacific and the Caribbean. Naval intelligence maps include marked zones known as submarine graveyards. These are areas where sonar has detected the outlines of dozens of unidentified hulls resting deep below the surface. Many are located in remote, difficult-to-reach places. Some are buried under layers of silt. Others are so badly corroded by salt water that recovery is nearly impossible. The ocean swallows metal, buries secrets, and keeps them hidden for years, sometimes forever. Yet despite the challenges, investigators continue to search. Teams of forensic divers, criminal analysts, marine biologists, and oceanographers have joined forces across multiple countries. Their mission is to locate, document, and analyze these wrecks. Some subs may still hold traces of DNA. Others might provide evidence that links directly to missing persons or unsolved weapons trafficking cases. Many of the bodies discovered inside these vessels are never identified. They are nameless, their identities lost to the currents, their lives forgotten by everyone except the cartels who used them and left them to die. Above ground, authorities seize cocaine, they make arrests, they dismantle labs and freeze cartel assets. But below the surface, in the cold and silent dark, lies something they cannot so easily erase: an unmarked graveyard of narco history. One that is only now beginning to be uncovered, and what lies down there may haunt the world for generations to come. What do you think about these chilling narco subs? Feel free to share your comments with us in the comments section. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video. What do you think about these chilling narco subs? Comment down below.